There we are. And hello, everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys and a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Wagner, Oklahoma. And over there in Memphis, Tennessee, is William Bell. William, how you doing this evening?
I'm doing very well, Don. Thank you. It's been a busy day.
Oh boy,
Actually, I
hasn't it?
worked to the wee hours of the morning, and then after I finally did get up, I had to rip and run up and down the street and take care of all kind of errands. And I'm almost finished. I'm trying to uh, get ahead a little bit. I just finished prior to getting on doing a Facebook lesson for Sunday, so that they wouldn't be out. And I'm going to try to record the next one after this broadcast or later
Right.
tonight. Then maybe I can rest a little bit for tonight before getting out of here on Thursday. I got one more day
Yeah.
to do that.
Well, you just informed me before we came on air that you will not be with us next Tuesday night because you're headed to South Africa. And what sounds like, I mean, it's not a lengthy engagement, but it's nonetheless an extremely exciting prospect. So why don't you tell us just a little bit about what you'll be doing in South Africa?
Well, there's a conference there, and primarily it's dealing with issues affecting the church and some issues affecting the Black community, family and social issues, and many others, violence, etc. And so I just got an opportunity to come and participate for about 15 minutes. So, but it's at the University of South Africa, and it is it looks like going to be a lot of people there, and so I'll see who I can meet, see who knows anything about eschatology along the way. And Leo and I, we're going, so we'll have about 3 or 4 days to just relax. I tried to build that in because it's 4 days of flying, 2 days to get there,
Yeah.
2 days to come back, and then the 4 days of an event, and so we'll have about 4 days outside of that to try to see what we can get into while we're there.
Well, that sounds absolutely incredibly exciting and sound like a wonderful opportunity to meet some people who will have influence in different spheres of life that perhaps you can interrelate to in the days ahead. So that offers some real potential as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, yeah,
It's assuredly exciting. That's for
yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, and we'll see how it turns out.
Yeah. Well, as long as you get back.
Uh,
Yeah, as long as you
definitely
get
looking
back
forward to
safely.
that.
South Africa, over the last several years after the end of apartheid, has not been a very safe place, at least for non-blacks. And so I'm assuming that it's going to be plenty peaceful and safe for you and Leora while you're there.
Well, I'm hoping so.
Yeah,
Definitely praying toward that end.
absolutely.
Appreciate all of the prayers on our behalf, while we're gone.
Absolutely. Well, it's hectic for me here also. I am working early and late on my lessons. As you know, I think I'll be going to Montana later this month
Mhm.
to speak at the conference there, and I'm very, very excited about it. I've never been to Montana and obviously never spoken at a conference anywhere up there, and the scenery up there is just staggeringly beautiful. I mean, it's just that is during the spring and summer. Now, the scenery might be beautiful in winter, but I don't consider 6 foot of snow to be beautiful.
I know that's right. I know that's right.
And so, by the way, Jack Scott and Paula are supposed to be at the conference.
Oh, well, that's good. That's good.
Yeah,
Jack used to live up that way, right? In
he live
Montana.
he lives in Montana
Oh, he
still.
still lives there. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I knew he was associated with Montana.
Yeah,
And
and he drives truck,
yeah.
all over the Western Seaboard. And but Tim Martin contacted me, and we were talking about this, that, and the other, and contacts, days gone by, and mentioned Jack. And I told him, I said, I'd love to see Jack and Paula again. And he said, well, you know what? We wanted to extend an invitation to Jack and Paula. And he said, well, he didn't know if they could afford it, all this kind of stuff like that. So he said, I told him that we would pay their way if they would come.
Hmm.
So he is due to be there. And so I can't hardly wait. It will
Oh,
it
that's
it
yeah,
will
that's
it will be really, really good to see Jack and Paula
yeah.
again. And from what I'm hearing, there's going to be a very good attendance at this conference. I think they're getting some excellent response, and so very, very, very exciting. I'm looking forward to meeting Steve Magua. Have you met him yet?
I haven't met him personally. He's not that far from me. I don't think he's in what, Missouri,
I
somewhere
think
in
so,
Missouri.
something like that.
He's not that far away.
Yeah,
But yeah, I watch him a lot and really enjoy a lot of the messages that he brings.
yeah, he's a sharp fella.
Yeah.
So anyway, uh, I was originally going to give two lessons on two different subjects. And when I started getting into the subject of the restoration of all things, I just thought, no, this has got to take both of my lessons.
Hmm.
Because I'm going to start in Genesis and go to maps, as Jack Scott likes to say. And there's just no way to do any justice to that subject of the restoration of all things in just 45 minutes. So I have been working diligently, like I said, early to late, trying to compact everything, organize everything, so that hopefully it's a coherent and cohesive and understandable two lessons that will make sense to everyone. I certainly hope so. I put an awful lot of hours into it if it doesn't make sense. So anyway, I tell you that, there's some really exciting things going on. I want to take just a moment. I got a notification just earlier in the day of how there is a new AI program for preterism.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I think it was Alan Morton who posted the notification to me and said that they have arranged the writings of all these different preterists, such as yourself, Jack, and Dave Curtis, uh, on and on.
Hmm. That's interesting.
And so it's going to be a database of the writings of full preterists, and you can go there and do your AI search and what have you. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Uh, we keep talking about what exciting times we live in because of the technology. Just over the last couple of days, I've been using AI, and I use Grok and Chat GTP or GPT, whichever one it is, as well as Clarity, because I found that sometimes Grok will be more comprehensive than Clarity, and vice versa, and then Chat GTP will add different nuances. So I've been using all three of those. I don't know of any other major ones, but there probably are, but I'm such a novice at this. I'm just now learning, but it's just staggering, absolute, pardon me, staggering how much information you can get just by typing in a simple question or two.
Mm. Yeah, I've used Chat GPT a little bit, and and maybe I'm using the other one and don't know it. And it shows you how ignorant I am of it. I have been tempted several times to enroll in the classes. You know, they say you can pretty much master this stuff in about a month or so, and I don't know
Yeah,
whether that's true. But I've been tempted to enroll in the class to do it. I just haven't pushed that final button. I get there and then I back up and say, I don't know whether I want to learn this stuff or not. But
I'm
I think
exactly
it has
this.
some benefits.
I'm exactly like you. I've threatened 100 times to engage in the course and to get truly proficient at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that I've got the time to dedicate to something like that. I just don't know. So I know that what I'm doing is dabbling on the periphery. I know it's got to be.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I don't want to take too much more time here, but I've been contacted by a fella. You may remember the name, Ron Wagner.
Oh,
He
yeah.
used,
I remember Ron.
yeah,
He was in Tennessee, wasn't he?
yeah.
Yeah.
I think he's in Florida now, if I'm not
Okay.
mistaken. But anyway, Ron is working on being accredited, and he has taken college courses on it, on AI. And he has volunteered just over the last few days. He's reached out to me and said, if you want me to help you research this or that or the other, just ask. And he said, I just absolutely love this. And so I asked him a question or two, just real brief, easy type things. And boy, he said, He sent me this stuff, and I'm going, I don't have time to read all that.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming. I
It
mean,
can be.
it's it's just tons and tons of information out there. So,
What's
I try to stay focused enough on the little that I can handle, let alone trying to go out there and pull tons more information in. But
I've got, excuse me, my vanity here. Uh, Forgive me, my vanity, but today, early today, I thought, I think I'm going to do a search on Grok and et cetera. I think I started with Clarity on what was the consensus belief concerning the end of the 70 weeks in the earliest of church writers. Well, I already had a pretty good idea. I've studied that issue out and what have you.
mhm,
And so it gave the three, pretty much the three views and what have you. And so I said, well, let me share with you, based upon the Septuagint, what I believe the Septuagint says and indicates concerning the end of the 70 weeks. And so I typed it in based on the Septuagint text, which to me is just as clear as day. At the at the full end of the divinely appointed time, the end of desolations will come. Well, the divinely appointed time was the 70 weeks. So at the end of the 70 weeks, the end is the end of desolations. What's the desolations? Judgment of Jerusalem.
mhm.
End of the 70 weeks at this in 70 AD. And I gave a little bit more information, and it immediately came back and said, this is a genuinely innovative, insightful, and thoughtful suggestion that is novel in its approach, but is perfectly consistent. And I brought in the feast days and the festival references in the book in Daniel 9, and it said drawing upon the festal allusions in Daniel 9 is truly a novel but purely valid concept
Mm.
that has not been explored in the literature. And I'm sitting here, my head's getting bigger by the minute.
They haven't read Dunn Preston yet, have they?
But it was so cool that it assimilated what I was sharing, and then it brought in information from all these different sources that it conflated with what I was sharing. And I tell you, it was amazing, and it really was encouraging to see that the concepts that I had developed, and obviously this is not a preterist, AI by any
Mhm.
stretch of the imagination. Um, And I know that any AI is only as good as the information that's fed into it. But the information that I was providing it was automatically being compared with all of the other views with the early church writers, as well as the commentators and scholars. And it was coming up with this extremely, extremely positive review of what I was sharing. So I thought it was just pretty cool.
Yeah, that is cool. That's great.
Yeah. Okay. So we want to continue our study, the Abrahamic Promise, because as we've been sharing with you over the last several weeks, ladies and gentlemen, by the way, in case you didn't catch it, William will not be with us next Tuesday. He will be in South Africa. And so we'll have somebody else to fill in for you. And so, nonetheless, we've been talking about the Abrahamic Promise. And William summarized for us in just 25 words or less what the Abrahamic inheritance was. Not only the physical, but the spiritual.
Well, the Abrahamic inheritance, as far as his natural descendants, was the land of Canaan, which God gave them after a certain period of time, and of course they inherited that. Um, and the spiritual part of the promise was the life that God had promised them all the way back from the garden, but that He channeled through Abraham and his descendants, which was the heavenly country, the land, the inheritance that Galatians 3:18 and 21 talks about, which was life from the dead. So resurrection, and that sums it up. I don't know how many words that was, but there you go.
That's pretty close. And yeah, that's the summation of it. That's what we're trying to get at to get people to see. And William, I don't know about you, but I've talked to people before, and when I bring up the concept that the Abrahamic inheritance really was resurrection life,
Mhm.
they go, "Wait a minute, where are you getting that?"
Wow.
Yeah, and I mean, I must confess him that in my early days in the Churches of Christ, I never saw that association because
Yeah,
that
and even after I said, "Wow," I sat back here and thought about it. Well, wait a minute. Now you didn't know that either for a long time.
yeah, that's exactly right. I never heard a single preacher expound on the idea of the Abrahamic inheritance being resurrection life. I mean, it never was discussed. It was
Yeah.
always, well, okay, Abrahamic promise is twofold. I will remember this in seminary. Abraham promise of Genesis chapter 12, twofold, spiritual, excuse me, the physical land promises, those were fulfilled, blah, 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 Joshua chapter 21, etc. And the spiritual promise made to Abraham that in your seed, all nations of the earth shall be blessed. That's Jesus Christ. That's the establishment of the church. Let's move on.
Hmm.
And that is not even close to the picture.
Yeah, I remember when I first connected the text in Acts chapter 3. I think I contacted you and talked about it. And you said, "Oh, you hadn't seen that yet." But I don't know if you remember that, but that was, some years ago. But nevertheless, it was one of the first times I really saw the connection. And man, was it awesome and just beautiful to see how the context of Acts 3 developed on into the early part of chapter 4, mention that resurrection.
Well, yeah, and matter of fact, Acts chapter 3 is the foundation of my lesson that I'm going to give in Montana on the restoration of all things.
Mm-hmm.
It really is the foundation of it
Yeah.
because it reaches all the way back and it reaches all the way
All the way
forward.
forward.
And it defines the nature of that Abrahamic promise of the blessing of forgiveness of sin.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, if the restoration is dealing with the forgiveness of sin, then it's not dealing with biological resurrection.
That's right. It ties beautifully in with Romans 11, but I'm not going to say anything. I know you got all that stuff in your lesson. So,
Oh, no, go
but
ahead.
I was just saying. I mean, it
Yeah.
ties right into
Oh,
uh,
absolutely.
Romans 11, and then if Romans 11 and First Thessalonians are parallel texts, then that ought to tell you what First Thessalonians 4 is all about as well,
That's
and
it.
all the rest of the resurrection passages.
Yeah. Uh, I wish I had some time to develop that all in my lesson. I can guarantee you that. But so, but because if a person is so disconnected from the Old Testament, which literally so many people are, there's no question about that. In the millennial world, that's especially true. If a person is disconnected from the narrative of the seed, of the original sin, and I don't mean original sin in the Calvinistic way, but if they're not familiar with the original sin of the garden and the promised seed to crush the head of Satan, and that seed being carried forward in, as you were saying, channeled through Abraham, and that being channeled through the nation of Israel to bring life to the nations, they're going to miss the entire story.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, it's like chopping the story of eschatology up into little bitty bits, and oh well, throw that away, throw that away. Okay, don't need this, don't need that. And this is what is troublesome to me. I think it was Max that I heard say at Ohio one year, William, and it becomes increasingly clear as time passes. He said something about some preterists have no deeper root than the time statements of Scripture.
Yes, he said that a lot.
Yeah. And you hear that, and the initial thought on it is, well, that's enough to convert a person to preterism, but it's certainly not enough to ground them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're trying to do here on Two Guys in the Bible is to give something more than a simple time statement.
And that's
And
one of the reasons I think that, several of those who claim, well, I've been a preterist
oh yeah.
and gone, is that, they just, for the most part, got a lot of the time statements and didn't dig deeper into, the meat and potatoes of what the preterist view is all about. Because, I mean, you really can teach a lot of it without even mentioning the time statements.
Oh yeah.
And, really getting to the heart of it. But if you come with that baggage of all of this physical and biological, you know, concepts, it's going to be hard, to fit that into the time statements. And so what happens is they start rejecting the time statements and saying, well, we know that couldn't have happened because what we already understand about these things didn't take place.
Yeah, that constant struggle and conflict between nature and time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's led some people, like you were saying, who are former preterists. Now they literally laugh and scoff at the time
Yeah,
statements,
yeah.
and they say the Jews had no interest in time whatsoever, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And Sam Frost, in a recent debate with Tristan Gabriel, he alluded to this book, right? No, this is wrong one. Oh, by Christian Becker. And
Okay.
he tried to convince the audience. And look, this got a lot of good things in it. It's got a lot of things that I just categorically disagree on. He takes a late date of Book of Revelation, and that influences his theology as a result of it. But nonetheless, he held this book up and tried to prove that men such as Christian Becker claim that the New Testament writers were not concerned with time whatsoever. And well, Christian Becker doesn't believe that. Or if he does, I haven't gotten that from the book so far.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just simply a misrepresentation. But that's where people like Sam Frost, Jeremiah Nortier, that's where they're going of just literally scoffing at time statements. So much so, I asked Sam a year or so ago, maybe 2 years ago, I said, is there one single New Testament eschatological text that uses the language of at hand, quickly, shortly, etc., that was using that language in an objectively imminent sense? And he said, no, not one.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked him as a follow up, when New Testament writers use this language of imminence in regard to non-eschatological, non-prophetic text, and they use the language of at hand, quickly, and shortly, were they using that language to convey objective nearness and imminence? And he said, yes. And yet, when they use the identical Greek words in the identical Greek tenses in regard to prophecy, they never use them in a temporally imminent sense. Now, if you want to see a case of, you'll excuse me for being so blunt, of just downright ridiculousness, that pretty well fits the bill right there. I mean, I wonder where you'd find that in any book on hermeneutic.
I
Hmm.
don't think it will. Just a huge case of cognitive dissonance.
You dropped out there, William.
Oh, did I? Let's see.
There you are.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what happened there. Okay. So back to the point. What we're trying to share here is that this Abrahamic promise and this narrative of the Abrahamic promise, which once again is a continuation of the Adamic promise of the blessing of the seed of woman, is carried throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. But what is so critical is that Paul is developing in Galatians. The writer of Hebrews does the same identical thing in the book of Hebrews. Paul does the same thing in the book of Romans, is to show that Abrahamic promise was not confined to Torah. It would come at the end of the age of Moses and the law. It was carried through that age,
Mm-hmm.
but it would arrive at the end of that age. And so I think we really kind of get into the meat of that discussion in Galatians chapter 3:15 and following. And I'll just read a few verses here. I think I'll read verses 15 to 18. Brethren, I speak after the manner of man, though it be but a man's covenant, no man disannuls or adds thereto. Now to Abraham and his seed, that's a singular seed, as he will say. Now to Abraham and his seed where the promise is made, he does not say, and to seeds as to many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is Christ. In this I say, that the law, which was 430 years later, cannot annul the covenant that was confirmed before by God in Christ so that it should make the promise of no effect. For if the inheritance is of the law, it is no longer of promise, but God gave it to Abraham by promise. William, am I misreading this, or is Paul not saying emphatically, very clearly, explicitly that the fulfillment of the Abrahamic inheritance, however we want to define it, okay, for the moment, however we want to define it, it was not going to come through the law, or to restate it, it would be carried through the law, but would not be achieved through the law.
Correct. That's
Okay.
definitely correct. That's what he's saying. And
Would
he's also saying, excuse me, that the promise was before the law.
Absolutely.
So it was already there before the law was given. That's his point. And then saying that the law which came after could not annul the promise that it should make it of none effect. So it's the promise that is what's, the overarching subject here, and not the law. The law comes in afterwards, but not to circumvent the promise as it had already been given. That was, by the way, one of Max's favorite topics too. When he talked about it, he always talked about the promise and the covenant that was first, even though it sort of got developed last, but it was actually first in order.
Yeah, I want to make two observations here. What Paul is saying here, or it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but he is saying something somewhat very, very similar to what he said in Romans chapter 4, when he says, was Abraham justified when he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Now, the Jews of Paul's day very firmly believed you had to be circumcised in order to be saved. And certainly the covenant of circumcision put one into the covenant community. Genesis chapter 12, 17 and following, Genesis chapter 17 as well. So the Jews had a right on one level to point to circumcision and say, hey, that's when you are officially recognized within the covenant community. But Paul strikes at the heart of the Jewish concept in Romans 4 and says, Abraham is justified by faith before he was ever circumcised. That was just, I mean, that's a dagger to the heart of the Jewish mentality of the day.
Oh, yeah.
And so he's carrying that thought right straight into Galatians, or we should say Galatians gave impetus to Romans because Galatians was written first. But the whole concept is the same, that Paul was saying and teaching something extremely radical in regard, radical as far as the Jewish mind was concerned. Because insofar as the rabbis was concerned, any man that was circumcised had a part in the world to come. That's what some of the rabbis said. And so, to them, it wasn't about righteousness. It was all about the physical mark of circumcision. And Paul just categorically rejected that view when he talked about just, pardon me, having lots of trouble, allergies the last couple of days. So again, this was really, really important in Paul's theology of developing, okay, the promise of the inheritance. And again, as you pointed out a moment ago, that was the promise of the spiritual city, the spiritual land. To put this in other terms, the new heaven and new earth. That promise was before the law. And the law, we can express it like this safely, accurately, I think. The law would reiterate that promise, but the law could never nullify that promise unless they tried to seek it through the law. Is that fair to say?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so he gives us some really just plain old common sense understanding of law, any law. If it is, Paul said, I speak after the manner of men, even though it's a man's covenant, If it's confirmed, no one annuls or adds to it. Well, again, that's just plain common sense. Uh, you know, we see really, really unfortunate things these days when someone dies and they've got an inheritance.
Mhm.
And the will says, I leave such and such to such and such at point A, B. And party C comes in and says, well, I think I get that.
Yeah.
I think that's mine. And the will doesn't provide it. So they want to change the will. And Paul's saying, you know what, legally sorry, that's just not allowable. And so, you know, we see so many sad situations of families in dispute over inheritances and what have you, but that's another subject. But one of the things, the second point that I wanted to raise here, William, is we hear a lot of talk in today's eschatological landscape about the church being an interim measure that the Father sent Jesus into the world to offer the kingdom to Israel. Israel, in unbelief, rejected the gospel. Therefore, God, as a plan B and as an interim measure, established the church to take the place of Israel. Thomas Ice even said on one occasion in one of his writings, I've got the citation in my database, responding to Kenneth Gentry. Kenneth Gentry said, the Old Covenant Israel has been set aside, and the church is now functioning as the chosen people of God. And Thomas Ice said, I can agree with Kenneth Gentry up to a certain point. It is certainly true that the church is currently, in the present age, replaced Israel, but that's not the way it will always be. The church will finally be set aside, raptured to heaven, and God will once again resume his dealings with exclusively with Israel. William, what does Paul have to say about an interim measure here in Galatians chapter 3, 15 and following?
Well, he says that, of course, it could not annul it. The law could not annul the promise, so that it made it of no effect, and that God had confirmed that promise before in Christ. So that means that it was not an afterthought. It was not something where he failed and had to come up with an alternate plan. That was the plan from day one, and it was never changed. And so what that's saying is that, you know, when you look at Christ, Christ is the promise. He's the promised seed. He's the promise. He's the church, for that matter. And to say that God came up with an alternate plan is to say that he didn't plan to send Christ from the beginning. That just doesn't make any sense.
Well, not only that, and to build on that, Paul is saying here that it was Old Covenant Israel that was the interim measure.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because here's Abraham and the promise that was given 430 years before the law, before Moses and the Old Covenant came into being. Yet the law was not the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise. It was an interim measure. And it could never deliver. It could never fulfill the Abrahamic promise. It couldn't annul it, never intended to annul it. But it was, in fact, Old Covenant Israel and the Tanakh was itself the interim measure. That's why Paul will go ahead to say we were kept under the law as a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, the seed, that singular seed of Abraham. So here's the singular seed of Abraham. Before Moses and the law were given, the promise of the singular seed was given, but he didn't come under the law or in the time of the law to be fulfilled in the time of the law. They were kept under the law until that seed should come. And some have taken that to mean, well, the moment Christ was born, the old law passed away. No, it's not what he's saying. But the point of it is that it was the old law that was the interim measure. That to me is just incredibly important. Like I said, in the landscape of eschatological studies that we have in our world today, when the dominant view, what is still the dominant view out there, says, "Oh no, the church was an interim measure. It's been set aside until what? Oh, until the arrival of the Abrahamic promise." And that completely misses Paul's point. Thoughts?
Well, I mean, you said it well. That idea of the schoolmaster really lays it out in terms of it being an interim aspect of that old law. And because the role of the schoolmaster was not to be there permanently, but only to be there for a particular time frame in the development of the child. And then once that period had been met, of course, now the child resumes that status of being mature and full grown before their parents. So that tells you that the intermediate state, that's pretty much with anything. That point is made so many times in the writings of Paul with different illustrations, different scenarios, whether you're talking about the espousal period, so to speak, or you're talking, but even then it goes far beyond that, because you're dealing with Israel all the way back from the beginning, from the time of their start. They became the school, they were like the schoolmaster that was leading them to Christ all the way from day one when the law started. So from that perspective, it gives you just a long period of time and history in their in that old covenant system, that they were to be this temporary measure until they reached the point of Christ. And as you say, till Christ come. And I know you'll probably develop that at some point of what that means, but it certainly isn't at the time that he was born. And I don't even think it's the time when he died on the cross, as far as that matter goes.
I don't either.
Yeah. And I know you don't, but there you have it. So
yeah. Okay, well stated. Okay, let's go on just a little bit and let's look again at verse 18. If the inheritance is of the law, it is no longer of promise, but God gave it to Abraham by promise. So once again, promise to Abraham before Moses, before Torah, before Sinai, pardon me, before the Decalogue, before the Pentateuch, before any of that.
That's like a sledgehammer, that first statement. First part of that statement. If the inheritance is of the law, it is no longer a promise. So, that knocks out the fact that it's not the promise, it's not of the promise, and it's not of Abraham. So that's very powerful.
Yeah, it's extremely powerful. And of course, to jump ahead, way ahead for the moment, but in chapter 4, 22 and following, he will tell us emphatically, the children of the flesh will not receive the inheritance. And that's another sledgehammer blow to the idea, because, again, to refer to the rabbinic writings, many of the ancient rabbis said, if you're circumcised, if you're of the lineage of Abraham, you have a part in the age to come, no matter what you've done. It was almost a type of universalism from their perspective. As long as you were circumcised, and as long as you were of the nation of Abraham, nation of Israel, so to speak, then guess what? You were assured a part in the age to come. And that's not Paul's perspective. That is not Paul's perspective at all. Okay, to continue. So that what Paul says, if the inheritance of the law is no longer a promise, that's going to raise the awareness of every good Jew who hears it. It's going to make them mad, and it's going to raise all sorts of theological issues, because you can just imagine a good Jew hearing this, maybe reading it, being heard for the very first time, and say, "What do you mean? What do you mean the promise is not of the law? Did not Jesus himself say, you search the scriptures because in them you think you have everlasting life, John 5:35 or 25, no, 35. So, I mean, this would have raised all sorts of objections in the mind. And as is commonly true, William, you've seen it happen in formal debate and private debate, discussions on and what have you. People automatically react emotionally and almost irrationally. So Paul imagines someone saying, well, if you're saying the inheritance is not of the law, then you're saying the law didn't have any purpose at all. You're saying the law is no good. You're saying that the law didn't even have a purpose. And Paul said, no, no, no. Calm down.
Or the other thing they do is reject Paul,
Oh,
say he
yeah.
he was talking about, and he's in error, he's a false teacher, etc., and just totally disregard him because the things that he say just doesn't go along with their view, and their you know exaltation and elevation of the old covenant
Of the
law
law of the law of
of
Moses.
the law. Yeah.
Uh, I have to admit, we read so many strange things, Williams. Uh, I told somebody the other day, I've got some pretty thick skin, to be honest about it. So I'm not easily offended. And I'm not real easily amazed, to be honest about it, because I've heard so much, I've read so much, and you kind of get hardened, calloused, and
Mhm.
what have you to hearing, excuse me, nonsense. I think it was last year for the first time in my life. I heard, and now I knew, I knew that in ancient times there were people who didn't like Paul. I knew that was true. But in modern times, I had not really encountered anyone. And so this individual starts sending me emails. And I was like, where is this guy coming from? I'm not tracking with this guy, not even a little bit. And finally, I pressured him. I put him to the point, really nailed him down on some of Paul's writings. And he said, well, your problem is you think Paul taught the truth. And I'm going, I didn't know that was a problem. He said Paul was a liar. Paul was a false teacher. And then I knew that's where his entire form of argument was coming
Mhm.
from.
Mhm.
He was going to argue from the law of Moses, and that means Paul was wrong. Paul was a liar. I have since encountered, I would say, at least three or four other individuals who just flat told me Paul was a liar.
Oh yeah.
Paul's a false apostle. And it's just, what was that I was saying? It's amazing what people will believe when they don't want to believe the Bible, when they've got
That's
their pet doctrine. And it's just, it really is quite stunning. Okay, so Paul anticipates someone saying, in regard to what he's just said, that is, the inheritance is not through the law, but through the promise. So they're going to ask, he says, what purpose then does the law serve? It was added because of transgressions until the seed should come to whom the promise was made. And it was appointed through angels by the hand of a mediator. Well, William, as you well know, this verse is just packed full of meaning. I mean, it is just absolutely chock full of meaning. So, what did Paul mean when he says that the law of Moses, was added because of transgressions?
well, well, it's to me, it's like Romans 5 when he says, moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound. He talked about the fact that through one man, sin entered the world, and then death by sin, and death passed upon all men. But he says, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam unto Moses. And so later on in the chapter, he says, moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound. And where sin abounded, grace is much more abound. So it was there to further define sin, and to put checks on sin, and to condemn sin even greater than what they had before. And I think that's what he's saying. It was added because of transgressions.
Yeah, I think that's precisely his point. And to maybe put a finer point on it, Paul certainly did not believe that the law was given to make men sin more.
Right, right.
It was made, or it was it was given and delivered to make man more acutely aware of his sin, and therefore more acutely aware of his need for forgiveness,
Mhm.
for grace, and for a savior. Pardon me. So, pardon me, William, go ahead. I got to use my puffer here for
Yeah.
some reason.
So, that's very significant in terms of saying that it was added because of transgressions, and I think also to put them in check so that they wouldn't uh, have what you might say freedom to sin without these laws. These laws were there to curtail the transgressions they were committing because they came with these additional penalties and condemnations for the infractions that they made against the law.
Yeah. So, in other words, what I hear you saying is the law was added not only to make man acutely aware of sin, but to act as a deterrent
Yes,
to sin.
that's it.
To saying, if you sin, this is the consequence.
Mm-hmm.
And let's face it, the Torah was Torah was pretty strict.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
I mean, you know, Exodus chapter 16, a man's out picking up firewood on the day on Sabbath, and people say, "What are we supposed to do with him?" The Lord said, "Kill him." That's pretty strict. And I think it was Charles Spurgeon. I'm reminded of this. And Charles Spurgeon said an awful lot of things that would make you think he was a preterist. And of course, he was alive and preaching during the days of
J.
the
Stuart Russell.
J. Stuart Russell. That's exactly right. I think he was pretty familiar with J. Stuart Russell.
He made some pretty good comments about his
Yeah.
work.
So uh, Spurgeon said, "Have you ever heard of anyone say, 'I long for the days when the death penalty for doing this or that or the other would still be in effect? I long for the days of offering the bloody sacrifices. I long for the days of having to approach God through a lineage of Israel." And I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But the point of it was there has been such a radical change. And he recognized we're talking about a new heaven and new earth. We are talking about a totally new covenant world. It's just it makes you wonder sometimes. Uh, had he come out in complete favor of the parousia of Russell's book, where theological studies might stand today, because he was profoundly influential there
Mhm.
in the 19th century. So it just kind of makes you wonder.
And then, just like today, you have some of these people who are very influential that pretty much know the truth, but they're not going to say it.
Yeah.
So they made comments, and they, are either somewhere in their behavior and their comments, they've expressed things that carry them to that logical end. They just don't come out and embrace it so that, a person could look at them and say, this is what they say, this is what they believe, et cetera, and use that fully. And who knows how many people were right there during the time of J. Stuart Russell that held those views and yet didn't express them.
Well, and you, pardon me, you and I have encountered people in our own ministries who have told us privately, and I'm certainly not going to name any names, but who have told us privately, look, I believe in covenant eschatology, but if I went public with it like you did, I'd get fired like you were, and I'm not going to do that.
Mm.
Well, I'm sorry. Okay, then don't stand in the pulpit and tell people they need to make any sacrifice in order to embrace it and to know and to have and to teach the truth. Don't talk to me about that if you're not willing to get up and stand for it yourself. So so anyway, here is Paul saying the law was added because of transgressions until the seed should come. Now you touched on it here a moment ago, and I did too. I have read people who say, well, Paul here is actually teaching that with the birth of Christ, the law ceased to be. It lost its power, lost its validity. Well, that's not the biblical view, to be sure. And so people tell us, well, and of course, this is the view that I was raised with in the churches of Christ in Colossians chapter 2, 16 and 17, that Christ nailed the handwriting of ordinances that was against us and contrary to us. He took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. There, Paul said, as clear as could be, that Paul took the law, or excuse me, Christ took the law out of the way. He nailed the law to the cross. Well, it was stunning for me to learn I had been completely wrong on that passage because that's not what it says. And I even wrote, William, I don't know if you remember this at all, but in my very first book, that little bright yellow book, The Late Great Kingdom, on Second Peter
I
chapter
remember
3,
that book. Mm-hmm.
well, I don't remember the page number, but I said very confidently, I might add, that in Romans chapter 7, Paul says very, very clearly that the law died. Someone pointed out to me some years later, I don't know if it was a guy named William Bell or not, it might have been, but someone pointed out to me, they said, Don, you need to go read that text again. Paul didn't say the law died, it says you died to the law. And it was like, you know, and it was, it was embarrassing, but it was also enlightening. And so, in my newer book, in my revised and enlarged book, I made note. I don't remember what page it was. I said, but in the very first edition of this book, entitled and on page such and such, I said the following, but I was wrong. And I've never had a problem saying I was wrong. Just like you, I've never had this problem with pride of saying I can't be wrong. I've been wrong a lot of times, probably wrong about some things now. When
Yeah,
I'm shown I'm wrong, just show me where I'm wrong.
I
So
think
anyway, go ahead.
I was just going to say the one thing that cured me of that, I mean, really seriously, was learning as covenant eschatology.
Oh, well,
Man,
no joke. Wow.
once you realize that, then you say, okay, what else am I wrong about? What else am I wrong about? And as you know, we continue to study all the way up through now. We're learning things. I mean, I've learned some things during the past week that I hadn't seen before, and you have to take a different stance.
Well, I'm the same way in my lesson or lessons for Montana. I have been involved in some really, really cool linguistic studies
Mm-hmm.
of the words that are used in the Septuagint to speak of the restoration of Israel, the apokatastasis and the diorthosis, the epistrepho and the anastasis. This has been very, and I guess I think I did some study on anastasis years and years ago. I know I did, but to go back into the Septuagint and to see how often
Mm-hmm.
anastasis is used to speak metaphorically of resurrection is really quite stunning. And so when I see and hear people today say that, oh, anastasis never refers to anything except biological resurrection, it's like, well, you hadn't read the Septuagint much at all.
Yeah.
That's to be sure.
When I wrote on that some years ago, I can't even remember what the title of that article, but it was in the Living Presence. And I remember doing that study on anastasis, looking at the noun and the verb
Yeah.
and those different variations of how it was used. And from that day forward, I mean, that cured me from any concept of wanting to apply that just to something physical, even though I knew prior to that it wasn't, but just to see it and, pick up Thayer's lexicon and just read what it says about the term.
Yeah.
And it'll blow your mind. At least it did mine way back then.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's what I'm saying. And a lot of what I'm studying and seeing is refresher, but a lot of it is brand new to me as well.
Mm-hmm.
And another study that has been just really, really mind expanding is the study of proselyte and how that word proselytos
Mhm.
is used throughout the Tanakh. It appears in 77 texts in the Old Testament. And we think of proselytes only within the context of the New Testament. That's the way I used to think of it. But when you see the term proselyte begin to be used in Exodus onward in 77 different texts, it's like, whoa, my concept of proselyte was pretty limited. So yeah, pretty
Yeah,
powerful.
and the way it's projected is that, all this was just kind of fly by night situation during the time of the old covenant. There wasn't much emphasis on it at all. And then if you're talking about 70 something references to it, that shows that there had to be a lot concerning it. I don't think I've looked that up. I remember doing one study when I was studying baptism, and I think you had either suggested a book to me, that big, thick, early
Everett
Christianity.
Ferguson, baptism in
Yeah, that one.
Everett
And
Ferguson.
and you start seeing some of the references to it there, and they talked
Mm-hmm.
about it. But yeah, it's an interesting study, and I think even ISBE had some references on it in terms of how pervasive it was in their culture, in their history.
Well, yeah, and a lot of the things that I've learned regarding it is how affectionately the term was used in even the prophetic books. I mean, and that, as a matter of fact, in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 14, the Lord uses proselyte along with native born, each of them having equal responsibility and equal blessing and equal culpability in sin and equal punishment for sin, and that is being cast out from among the people. I mean, equal standing. And then you come to passages, and I know this is a little bit off of our subject for tonight, and yet not really, because Galatians 3:14 talks about the Gentiles receiving the promise of the Spirit. So, it's interrelated, maybe tangentially, but in Ezekiel 47:22 and 23, the Lord says, when you cast lots for the disbursement of the land, and as you and I talked about in our study of Ezekiel 40 through 47 and the Messianic Temple, uh, this has broadly been, and all you have to do is look up on Grok and GP and Clarity, and you'll find that the consensus has almost always been this is Messianic. Well, again, in Ezekiel 47:22 and 23, the Lord said to Israel, when you cast lots for the disbursement of the inheritance among the tribes, and those proselytes, it's strangers, but it's proselytos, and the strangers among you, you shall give them an equal portion in the land. Proselytes in the Messianic kingdom would receive the equal portion with Israel. That's pretty stunning. And I have held for years that this is one of those texts that for Paul was the basis of his doctrine of the mystery of God. That is Jew Gentile equality in Christ, equal heirs and equal participants. Because I mean, Ephesians 3:8 is almost an echo of Ezekiel 47:22 and 23. It to me at least, it is. I think it's extremely, extremely powerful. Okay, so William, in about a minute here, if when he says that the law was added that because of transgressions until the seed should come to whom the promise was made, if the coming of the seed was not the birth of Christ, if it was not the cross, then what is the coming that he's talking about?
The coming would be the parousia.
Ah, bingo. And that, folks, really, really changes the landscape of discussions of the passing of the law. So we'll have to pick this up. William, you and I will pick this up in about 2 weeks because uh, I want you and me to develop it and flesh it out because boy, this is rich, rich stuff. And I think it reflects right back on Romans chapter 5 and verse 14. Death reigned from Adam to Moses until what? Adam, who was the type of the one who is
Coming.
to come, about to come,
About to come.
about to come. So here you have Paul saying Christ was about to come. Here you have Paul saying in Galatians chapter 3 that the law was added until the coming of the seed. Those are parallel passages in my estimation.
Yes.
Okay, great to be with you, William. Please have a safe trip. Godspeed to you. Give our love to Leora. Have a great time. We look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
And you leave when? When do you leave?
I believe it's the third week
Oh, okay. So
of
I have to be
Montana.
back
Yeah.
before you leave. Okay.
I'll let you know when you get back.
All right. Very good.
All right. Good night and God bless, folks.
Okay.
All right, man.
All right. Take care of yourself.
You bet. You too, man.
All right.
Bye bye.